This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, I think we are all set. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I will be your co-host. This is the Battle of Midway, the pivotal naval battle of World War II, 80th anniversary live stream program. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Robert Kellerman. I'll be more of your co-host tonight, or the MC or something like that, because the real host is our special guest of honor, Deirdre O'Sullivan. And if you've not met Deirdre before, she is the host of our well-known Pentagon 9/11 Memorial Tours, these in-person tours that she's done a few times for us in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Perhaps we'll investigate seeing if we can do these. These have been on hold because of COVID, but we'll look to see if we can start these back up at some point in time in the future, perhaps in September. And there's Deirdre herself. And if you missed it, this is one of a series of live stream history programs that Deirdre has been generous enough to provide to us, to share some of her expert knowledge with us. The one that she did about, I think it was about a little over a month ago, was the Great War, the rise and fall of empires from 1914 to 1918. If you missed that, there's a recording of it on our YouTube channel, and the link for that was in the Zoom information that we sent out earlier. I'll also be happy to email it out a little bit later as well. And then also, because not everyone's in Washington, D.C. and can make it to her in-person tour, she was kind enough to do a Pentagon 9/11 Memorial virtual tour, and a recording of that is also on our YouTube channel. And that was also the link for that included in the Zoom information that I sent out earlier. But tonight, we're going to be talking about the Battle of Midway, the pivotal battle, the naval battle of World War II. And with that, I will turn things over to Deirdre. Deirdre, take it away. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us, and it's all yours.
Okay, I just want to make sure you can see the screen.
Let's see.
I think I am sharing my screen.
It hasn't come up yet, but sometimes it takes a few seconds.
All right, there it is.
Oh, I see it coming.
Okay, and can you see?
Well, let's see, it popped up for like a second and then it went away.
Of course it did. Why would it do that?
Oh, now it's back. Okay, maybe it just took a little bit of time. Okay, and I can see the screen clearly. I can hear you clearly, and everything looks perfect.
What about, can you see me?
No, but 2 out of 3.
All right, let's try to start the video again, see if that works. Okay, I've started the video.
Sometimes it just takes a second.
Because you're the host?
No,
okay.
That shouldn't matter. Sometimes it just takes a second.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. You can see the screen. We'll go from there. Okay, so what we're talking about today is the Battle of Midway, and this is the turning point in the Pacific War. So a very famous book was written in the 1960s by Walter Lord, and I actually read it 100 years ago. And there's a wonderful quote from it, and said they had no right to win, yet they did. And in doing so, they changed the course of the war. Even against the greatest of odds, there's something in the human spirit, a magic blend of skill, faith, and valor that can lift men from certain defeat into incredible victory. So I think that really frames kind of what the Americans were up against, and yet how they still managed to succeed. So let's go to the next slide. Now in theory, I can move that. There we go. Okay, so we're going to focus on 3 main areas. The first thing we're going to focus on is, why did the Empire of Japan attack the U.S. Navy stationed at Pearl Harbor on December 11th, 1941, and then declare war against the United States? Kind of what are the key events that kind of pushed us into the war that started on December 7th? And then we're going to talk about some of the key events that occurred between December 7th and then the Battle of Midway, which occurred in June of 1942. So there was about 6 months in between the Battle of Pearl Harbor and then the Battle of Midway, and a couple of things happened in between. And then we're going to talk about the Battle of Midway and kind of what happened in its immediate aftermath. So the first thing we need to do is kind of frame what's going on in the Pacific starting in 1931. So we're going to talk about the great powers that kind of control the area that today is known as Asia. I'm going to refer to it as Asia slash the Pacific. So the first thing we're going to talk about is Japan. Now, Japan has a long history dating back to its first settlers that arrived in 30,000 BC. Now, from 1100 to 1800, there's the area known as the Japanese feudal era, and it was dominated by the ruling class of warriors known as the samurai. Now, historians talk about the modern age that begins in Japan in 1854, when Commodore Matthew Perry from the U.S. Navy arrives in Japan. And with that kind of begins the modern age. Now, what's going to happen is instead of having these individual families kind of ruling areas of Japan, it's going to start being consolidated under the emperor. And all political power, military power, all of it is going to just kind of condense and be shaped into the emperor. And in addition to that, they're going to start adopting Western institutions. They're going to start building factories. They're going to start doing modern farming techniques. They are going to start doing a bureaucracy. They're going to do courts, and they're going to create a military that is going to be based on Western principles. So at the turn of the century, Japan has really now emerged as an industrial power and one of the most developed countries in Asia. So the Empire of Japan is going to really enter the world stage in 1905 when Japan defeats Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. Now, Russia wanted a seaport on the Western Ocean that did not freeze during the winter. The Japanese considered this an encroachment. The Russians underestimated the Japanese and in turn suffered a very humiliating defeat. By 1900, Japan had conquered Taiwan, which was then known as Formosa, and Korea, and they wanted recognition from the other world powers. They weren't going to get it. Now, Japan is going to enter the Great War on the side of the Allies, and they're going to help push China or push Germany out of China, but they're going to have very little say in the final treaty. So if we look here on this map and we go down, so here is Korea. To the left of Korea, there's this tiny little dot here, and that's basically the German territory. So during the Great War, the Japanese are going to partner with the British and basically force the Germans out of this region. And really, it's going to get turned over to the British. So they're really not going to get much out of this. But their territorial ambitions are really just beginning. Now, the great power in the Pacific really lies with the British Empire. So I have taken this enormous map of the British kind of global enterprise and really reduced it down to the area that I'm referring to as the Asia Pacific arena. So the most powerful, the British have the most powerful navy and the largest empire in the world. And after the defeat of Napoleon in 1850, Britain is going to become the principal naval and imperial power in the 19th century. Britain's most important colony is right here in India, and then some of the colonies in and around China, including Hong Kong. Now, they also control large areas of the South Pacific, starting here in Australia and New Zealand. They have an area in Papua New Guinea. They have a lot of the Solomon Islands, as well as here in Singapore. So as the Great War ends in 1918, the British are victorious, but the war has been very costly. The British have gained new territory, but they are in serious debt and their army has just been shattered. Still, they remain the world's dominant power in the Asia-Pacific theater. So in my last presentation, I got a question about the Chinese and whether or not they're considered kind of a world power. I would not have considered them such. And one of the reasons is in 1911, the Civil War is going to break out in China. And then the last emperor is going to have to concede in 1912. He's going to be brought back, but really for the next 20 years, there's going to be this period of internal fighting in China. And the various factions and warlords are going to fight for control of China. Now, in addition to that, you're also going to have the encroachment of the European powers, which obviously just want more and more control over China. So if we look here, British India is, there's also Tibet, kind of the British area of influence. They also have an area of influence in and around the coast. And then down here, you have the French. So the French missionaries arrive in a country known as Vietnam in the early 1600s. But by the 1960s, the French have consolidated control over the region known as the French Indochina, or modern Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And their influence is extending all the way into China proper itself. So you kind of have these different powers that are juggling for control over China. So you have the different warlords within China, you have the British, you have the French, you now have the Japanese, and then you also have the Americans. The heck did they come from? So if we look at the United States obviously, when did it get involved in the Pacific? And it really starts in the mid 1880s when it really takes Hawaii. And it starts dealing with some of these smaller islands outside of the Pacific. But it kind of thrusts itself onto the world stage in 1898 when it goes to war with a country that was once the most powerful in the world, and that would be Japan. So Spain. Where did Japan come from? So in the end of the war in 1898, the US will have new territories in the Pacific. They are going to be known as Philippines. They're going to get Guam, and then I think they're going to take Wake Island. So in addition to that, Teddy Roosevelt, who is the first president of the 20th century, will start building a navy. You can't have a modern country if you don't have a navy. So he is going to now launch this new navy, and he's going to send it across the world to tell everyone that he has arrived, that the US has arrived. Sort of he has arrived, but also the US has arrived. So in 1817, the United States enters the war on the side of the Allies. This is World War I. So they're going to fight with the British and the French against the Germans. Even before the US declares war, it is going to be supplying the Allies. Its industrial output is unbelievable. It doubles and then it doubles again. But after the war ends, the US isolationist tendencies really come to the forefront. And one of the things as a result of the Treaty of Versailles is the League of Nations. And the US doesn't even enter it. It wants no part of being entangled into another foreign war. On the other hand, it still continues to hold on to its territories in the Pacific. So it's kind of mixed. It doesn't want to be part of the European wars. It doesn't want to be part of the League of Nations, but it has no intention of giving up its territories that it holds in the Pacific. So it's this weird dichotomy that's going on. Now, in 1929, there is an event that causes shockwaves throughout the world. What would that be? What happens in 1929? FDR is secretary under Wilson. Yes. So FDR is a secretary. I'm sorry, there's some questions that are coming into the chat room about FDR, President Roosevelt, who at the time in World War I is the Undersecretary of the Navy in World War I. So the question I asked was, what happened in 1929 that caused shockwaves around the world? And the answer, of course, is the stock market crashed. So on Black Monday, which is October 28th, 1929, the stock market in New York City crashes, which is really the beginning of the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression is going to hit both the European powers and the US very hard. Okay. Now, there's also opportunities to be had. You know, when everybody else is in crisis, you can see, people see opportunities that other people do not. They only see crisis. So Japan now sees an opportunity. The whole world is distracted. There's a lot of financial issues going on, and they're going to use this opportunity to invade Manchuria. So in 1931, Japan is going to invade Manchuria in the northern part of China. Now, is it part of China? That's somebody else's, issue. It's not part of the Soviet Union. We'll phrase it that way. Now, the League of Nations is very concerned about this action, and it condemns it. So the Japanese just walk out. So they're in the League of Nations. They basically say, thank you very much, and walk out the door. And this invasion of Manchuria in 1931 is really going to start the ball rolling, which will end up at war with Japan, at war with the United States and other European powers. So that's kind of just the beginning. 1931 and the invasion of Manchuria is really just the start of their territorial ambitions. The next move is going to be in 1937, Japan is going to invade mainland China. So it's going to start with Beijing, which is then at time known as Peking. It's going to get Shanghai and Nanking, but soon it's going to run into resistance by the Chinese themselves. And they're going to hold all these cities kind of along the coast, but they are going to be unable to hang on to the interior. And Nanjing is going to become kind of the head or the government, for lack of a better word, of the Chinese nationals that are trying to hold on to the interior as the Japanese Japanese control the coastline. So this is going to start triggering a response from the United States. So in 1937, the US government is going to start encouraging US business to stop doing trading with Japan. It's not forcing them, it's not a law, it's basically encouraging them to stop doing businesses with Japan. But US is soon going to be very distracted by other crises. So all the way on the other side of the world, on September 1st, 1939, Germany attacks Poland, and the French and the British declare war on Germany. This pulls the attention of the European powers away from Asia. So in 1940, the European war is going to turn on the French and the British when France falls to Germany in June of 1940. This means that French Indochina, which is this area right here, is going to now fall under the Japanese area of influence because Japan is, of course, allied with Germany. Now, another European power with territories in the Pacific will also fall under the Germans, and that is known, and that would be the Netherlands. The question in the chat room has to do with whether or not German families are going to be allowed into China. And I apologize, I don't know enough about that to answer that question. There's also a question in there about the stock market. Okay. So let's talk about the Dutch East Indies. Let's see when I go here. Okay. So in the early 1700s, the United East India Company is created out of the Netherlands, and it establishes a colony in the area what is now known as Indonesia. The area has incredible spices that are really coveted by the Europeans, including nutmeg, pepper, and cinnamon. But by the early 20th century, it has new commodities that are even more valuable, and they would be both oil and rubber plantations. Now, the rubber plantations produce liquid rubber, which then has to be changed, and it becomes rubber that we use on tires. So when the Netherlands falls to Germany in June of 1940, Japan, who is allied with Germany, sees an opportunity to seize the commodities and add new territories. So now it wants the area that is known as the Dutch East Indies because there's oil and there's rubber, and they need both if you want to have a modern army. Now, the British are concerned about the Japanese, but they got a problem. They're facing the Germans, and they're barely hanging on to their country as is. And they have a very large navy, but it's trying to hold on to the country of England. It is trying to hold on to Gibraltar, which is the entrance to the Mediterranean. It is trying to hold on to the Suez Canal. In Egypt, it's also trying to hang on to India. It can't stop the Japanese. But the Japanese aren't worried about the British. The Japanese are worried about the US Navy, which is now located in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. So let's talk about the road to Pearl Harbor. So yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Now, anyone who studied history is very familiar with the speech. This is the speech in which US President Franklin D. Roosevelt provided to the joint session of Congress the day after Pearl Harbor, December 8th, 1941. So let's talk about the road to Pearl Harbor. Some of this is a repeat of what we've already discussed. So 1931, Japan invades Manchuria. 1937, it invades mainland China. 1939, Germany invades Poland. France and Great Britain are now at war. June 40, France is going to surrender to Germany. The German army will be evacuated back to England, and the British will fight on, not flight on. How come you can only see it once you're doing the presentation, didn't see it the 10 times you read it before this? In the summer of 1940, US President Franklin Roosevelt is going to order the US Pacific Fleet to leave its harbor in San Diego and travel to Pearl Harbor. Now, this is to send a message, of course, to the Japanese, and the message the Japanese get very loud and clear. Now, the Pacific Fleet is a serious fleet. It has massive firepower. It includes 9 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, 12 heavy cruisers, 8 light cruisers, 50 destroyers, 33 submarines, and 100 patrol aircraft. That is some serious firepower. And it has left the West Coast and it is now located in Hawaii. So who is this person? Kind of obvious, but anyone want to hazard a guess? That would be FDR, correct. Now, FDR was elected president in 1932, the first president following the stock market crash and the start of the Great Depression. 1 out of every 10 men is currently unemployed in the United States. For minority groups, the employment rate is even higher. President Roosevelt campaigned for, quote, a New Deal for Americans. He is much more concerned about domestic affairs than he is foreign affairs. It is really not until Japan invades China in 1937 that his administration even pays attention to what is going on in the Pacific. Now he starts taking Japan more seriously, but because of the isolationist feelings within the United States, there's really not much he can do about it because most Americans are very adamant that they have no interest in being involved in another war. So, anyone tell me who this individual is? He's a little harder than the last one. Tojo, correct. So Tojo is the Prime Minister of Japan starting in October of 1941. He spent most of his career in the military after attending the Japanese Military Academy. In 1938, he was the Vice Minister of War and one of the leading advocates of allying with Germany and Italy. In 1941, he becomes Japan's Prime Minister, and under his leadership, the Japanese Navy is sent to Pearl Harbor. So this is kind of the road that kind of gets us there. So in 1940, Japan is going to invade French Indochina following an agreement with the French. Now, this is going to cut off all supply lines basically to China, except going over the Himalayas, which is almost impossible at the time. Now, because of the invasion of Indochina, this is again going to set off the Americans. So it's really going to come to a head in July of 1941 when the U.S. ceases all oil imports to Japan. 80% of all the oil that is used in Japan comes directly from the United States. Now, the other 20% either comes from the Netherlands and the Dutch East Indies, or it's coming from Great Britain. So as soon as the United States declares an oil embargo, they're going to follow suit. And now basically Japan is cut off. And it's not as if they can get it from other places. There is obviously oil in the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union needs all of its oil for the war that's going on in Russia between them and the Germans. So there's really not extra oil lying around that they can buy from other sources. So they're in real trouble. Now, how much oil do they have left? I've read different accounts. They claim that they had 2 years. I read something somewhere else. They only had 3 months. But either way, you can't be a modern country without having oil. But there's still an opportunity for peace. So in the fall of 1941, there's lots of peace talks, lots of messaging going back and forth between Tokyo and Washington, trying to come up with a deal that would basically prevent war. It doesn't look like any of it's going to work. And in October of 1941, when Tojo becomes the prime minister, he makes this very big speech, and it's called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Spear. And the idea is we're going to unite all the Asian nations together under the Japanese rule. So we're going to push out all of those European powers, and we're going to replace them with the Japanese. So I read this very interesting thing on the internet, and somebody was talking about the fact that, World War II wasn't World War II. It was really an attempt to overthrow all the European powers which were dominating Asia. And after World War II, most of them weren't able to come back. And isn't that a good thing? And I thought that was a very interesting take on it. But on the other hand, the Japanese were not there to liberate countries and give them the ability to decide their own future. They were just replacing the Europeans who were there. So it really wasn't done for altruistic reasons. So who is this gentleman? Exactly. As Robert has pointed out, the Middle Eastern oil really wasn't until after World War II. Correct. This is Yamamoto. So Yamamoto, and again, I apologize for mispronouncing Japanese names. Isoroku was the Japanese Marshal Admiral of the Imperial Navy. He served in the Imperial Navy after graduating from the Japanese Naval Academy. He spent time in the United States and advocated for naval aviation. He was the principal planner of the attack for the fleet against the attack at Pearl Harbor. Now, he started planning this attack in January of 1941. So almost a year before they went to war, he started thinking about how they were going to be able to pull this off. And in April of 1941, the Japanese pilots started training for the mission. Now, one of the issues that was discussed between the Army and the Navy is whether or not they should also plan for an invasion of Hawaii. And the decision was made that it was more important once to actually take the Dutch East Indies than it was to take Hawaii. Because again, without oil, you can't have an army, you can't have a navy. So the decision was made, instead of invading into Hawaii, that they were instead going to do offenses in the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines and Guam, and then knock out the British in Singapore and in Hong Kong. So on November 26, 1941, the Japanese Naval Task Force leaves Japan heading for Pearl Harbor. In this naval task force is going to be 6 aircraft carriers, more than 400 aircraft, a battleship, multiple cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and then midget submarines. So on December 7th, 1941, at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, 353 Japanese aircraft from 6 aircraft carriers will attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet in 2 distinct waves. So they're going to come in, bomb, then they're going to go back, refuel, reload armaments, and then come back and hit it again. So once the battle is over, which is in 2 distinct waves, you're going to have 8 battleships that are going to be sunk, along with 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, 1 training ship, and a mine layer. More than 180 aircraft will be destroyed on the ground, mostly. There are a few that do manage to get into the air. And 2,403 Americans will be killed, and 1,100 will be wounded. Almost 1,100 will die on the USS Arizona alone. And as you can see here from this picture, this is what the U.S. Correct. It was not sunk, but it wasn't one of the ones that was sunk, but it almost, they were all pretty heavily damaged. This is the USS Arizona. Half the people who are going to get killed are going to be killed on this ship. Now, most of the damaged ships will eventually return to service because of the very shallow waters in the Pearl Harbor. This ship, however, will not. This is the USS Arizona, and they are going to build a memorial on it, and it still sits there in Pearl Harbor. Now, Tora 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 was the code sent by the Japanese pilot back to his superiors to let them know that their objective of complete surprise had been achieved. One of the questions was when was the Japanese decision? Really, it's confusing. Once the Japanese fleet left Japan, it was in end of November 26th. And the idea was that if the peace talks went anywhere, that they could pull them back. So when was the decision made? It really was made in the end of November, with the idea that perhaps they could pull back at the last minute. Now, the interesting thing somebody put in there is that the U.S. air carriers were not in port. That is correct. There were 3 U.S. air carriers that are attached to the Pacific Fleet. Now, they just happened not to be in port on that day. So it's not that they managed to escape the attack. They literally just weren't there. And it was really just happenstance that they managed to avoid the attack. 2 of them were patrol. One of them had gone to Wake Island, was on its way back. One of them were coming back from the West Coast. So they just happened on that day not to be inside the port when the surprise attack occurred. Very good point. So one of the things that, if you watch any of the propaganda films or anything that came out during World War II, one of the things you will talk about is they always refer to as the sneaky Japs. Well, one of the reasons you can use that phrase is because of the fact that they did not actually formally declare war against the United States. Now, somebody also brought up the idea of a third attack. Now, there was a third wave that was planned, but the decision was made by the commander of the task force is that it was too risky, that the Americans now knew we were coming, and he didn't want to risk his aircraft carriers. So the third attack would have been on the oil tankers, and that if they had struck the oil tankers or the shipyards where they could repair, that would have caused even more damage and more problems. So that was a split decision that was made, trying to err on the side of caution, that ended up costing the Japanese in the end. Very good point. So meanwhile, back in Washington, we always talk about Washington being slow to react to things. Well, this unfortunately is not a new phenomenon. So starting in the mid-1940, the U.S. got very, very good at reading the secret intercepts between Tokyo and the United States. So Roosevelt was able actually to read all of the intercepts, all the coded messages going from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in Washington. So they kind of had a pretty good idea as to the thought process of the Japanese and what the ambassador was being told to tell the Americans even before the ambassador would arrive to tell the Americans whatever. So on December 6th, 1941, a diplomatic message was sent from Tokyo to the Japanese ambassador in Washington. Now they were told it was going to come in 14 different parts. So the Americans saw that these messages were coming in. They knew they were coming in 14 parts, and they were able to read the first 13. But it wasn't until the morning of December 7th that the last part of the message finally got through. And they were able actually to read it before the Japanese could deliver it. So at 1 o'clock, the Japanese diplomats requested a meeting with the U.S. Secretary of State Hull. The appointment was set for 1:45, but it took place at 2:20 by the time they actually sat down in a room together. But by the time the meeting had taken place, the attack at Pearl Harbor was basically over. So they presented their message to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State read the message. It got all the way to the end, and it said, quote, "The Japanese government regrets to have notified the American government that in view of the attitude of the American government, it cannot but consider that it to be impossible to reach an agreement through further negotiations." Now, some people have interpreted that mean that that's a declaration of war. That's not. That's a cutoff. That's basically an ending of diplomatic relations. The declaration of war didn't appear until the next day. So the December 8th, a declaration of war was made by Japan in Japanese newspapers, and that was published on December 8th, 1941. Did the Japanese know that there was a planned attack? They certainly were not told. They were told to continue negotiations of peace. That was their job. The job of whether or not to decide to go to war wasn't made by the diplomats. That was made back in Tokyo by basically the government. So no, they really didn't know that the attack was going on. They certainly were not notified ahead of time. So how did the Japanese find out where they didn't know? Well, we're getting there. So the Americans did not know that they were coming to Pearl Harbor. There were enough things floating around that later they were able to put it together, but they had not gotten to the naval code. So they really didn't know that they knew that the Japanese Navy left Tokyo. They didn't know where they were going. And they certainly had not yet declared war against the United States. So the United States was not prepared for it. So there's a lot of diplomatic and strategy, and the other thing in which they were always trying to do is achieve surprise. And if you declare war, you basically have a hard time achieving surprise. So there's always a lot of back and forth as to whether or not war had been declared. And really, when they attacked Pearl Harbor, they had not declared war against the United States. The United States declared war almost at the same time when President Roosevelt requested a declaration of war from the United States on the 8th of December. Now, we always think of Pearl Harbor as an enormous event that occurred because it destroyed large portions of the American Pacific Fleet. But that was really just the beginning. So when Prime Minister Winston Churchill was told what was going on, he suddenly realized how vulnerable his empire was. He had been dealing with the fact that his country was vulnerable, but now he realized that there was really nothing he could do to stop the Japanese aggression. And this is his quote: "In all the war, I never received a more direct shock. As I turned and twisted in bed, the full horror of the news sank in upon me. There were no British or American capital ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific Ocean, except for the American survivors of Pearl Harbor who were hastening back to California. Over this vast expanse of waters, the Japanese were supreme, and we everywhere were weak and naked." So not only was he dealing with the threat from Germany, but he now realized that he had a threat from Japan as well, and there was nothing he could do about it. So let's talk about what happens next. So because of the date line, it's hard to understand, but it's almost happening simultaneously. So on December 8th, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, but within hours of that, they're also attacking, almost simultaneously, they're attacking the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, and the British-held territories in Malay, Singapore, and Hong Kong. So all of this is happening literally at the same time. So within a couple hours of each other. But because of the date line, it appears as though it happens the next day. It doesn't. It's really almost happening all at the same time. Now, the British do try to stop the French, or sorry, the British do try to stop the Japanese, and they send out 2 ships. So on December 10th, 1941, Her Majesty's ship, or the HMS Prince of Wales battleship, and the HMS Repulse battle cruiser, they're both sunk by Japanese aircraft. Huge shock to the British, the fact that you can sink a battleship with 1 aircraft. This had never been done before, and it really starts people thinking, wait a minute, if our love or our attention all gets focused on the battleship, and yet 1 aircraft can sink an entire battleship, this really needs to start thinking, changing people's thinking about how they think of what the most important ships are in the Navy. And you're right, one of the things they talk in here, now there is a General MacArthur who I'm not really talking about in this presentation. Now he is in charge of the territory or the American army that is located on the Philippines. Now he gets some sort of notification that they are attacking Hawaii, but he really doesn't think they're coming for him. And he gets caught really by surprise. And most of his aircraft are going to be destroyed on the ground. So in January of 1942, Japan also invades British Burma, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. After being driven out of Malaysia, the Allied forces in Singapore attempt to resist the Japanese, and they are finally forced to surrender on February 15th, 1942. Now, almost at the same time, the Japanese are going to start threatening Australia. And everyone's like, what is this? It's happening so fast. So 3 months after Pearl Harbor, suddenly the Japanese are bombing Australia. And they bomb Darwin in northern Australia, and they are threatening Australia. In the meantime, what's left of the British Navy is pulled out. So whatever elements of the British Navy was still in the Pacific Ocean, we're out of here. They are actually going to retreat to the Indian Ocean because you have to hang on to India. It's their most important colony. Now, the American Navy is going to completely abandon the Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam, and they are all going to fall to the Japanese by May of 1942. So May of 1942, all of this is now kind of under the Japanese. So the only 2 places that are left are right down here, Papua New Guinea, which is controlled by the British, Australia, Midway, and the Hawaiian Islands. Everything else is going to fall under the Japanese, and it's going to happen very fast. So the next step is really going to be Doolittle Raid. So one of the questions that the president is going to have is, why can't we attack Japan? And the Americans are like, because we can't. Our long-range bombers can't hit it. We can't. The Russians won't allow us to use their bases, and we have small planes, but we only have 3 carriers in the entire Pacific Ocean. And if we lose our carriers, we may have to pull back to the West Coast. We may have to abandon Midway and the Hawaiian Islands, and for that matter, Australia, and pull all the way back to the West Coast. So this doesn't make any sense. But on the other hand, it's an order for the president. So let's figure out how to make this work. So in the end, it is an American submariner who comes up with the idea of taking Army bombers and launching them off of an aircraft carrier to bomb Japan. Now, Army bombers cannot land on U.S. carriers. They're too big and they're too heavy. They might be able to take off, but they're not going to be able to land without damaging the deck. So the idea is they're going to take off the aircraft carrier, and then they're going to land in the interior of China, which is still held by Chinese forces and not the Japanese. This is an extremely daring, and it's very dangerous, but they managed to pull it off. On April 18th, 1942, 16 Army B-29 bombers are going to take off from the USS Hornet, and they're going to do it 650 miles off of Japan. They were supposed to do it at 400 miles off of Japan. Instead, they are actually run into Japanese fishermen. They are afraid that they have been spotted. They launch 650 miles off of the coast. They have enough fuel to make it to Japan. The question is do they have enough fuel to make it to China? And that is a very iffy question. So they do manage to make it to Japan. They do drop their bomb loads. It doesn't do a whole lot of damage, but it really impacts the psyche of the Japanese people, and especially the Japanese military. So once they leave Japan, they then fly along the coast and most of them manage to crash right along the Chinese coast. And shockingly, most of them survive. So in the end of the day, only 3 die, and then 8 become Japanese POWs. Out of the 8 that become Japanese POWs, 3 are executed, 1 dies in prison, and then the other 4 are released at the end of the war. Yeah, they do a tremendous amount of modifications of Doolittle's bombers, and there was a lot of training. In fact, if you watch the movie Pearl Harbor, they talk about it at length. But they had to strip some of the armor off. They had to, in order to make them light enough to get off of the deck. But they do manage to pull off this very spectacular raid on Japan. Now, how much of an impact it had on the ground? Well, it did have an impact on Yamamoto. So Yamamoto concludes that there was an enormous mistake made at Pearl Harbor when they did not get the U.S. air carriers. And there are 3 aircraft carriers, and he needs to take them all out. If not, he's going to leave the island of Japan vulnerable to an attack. And somebody did point out that one of the bombers actually did land in Russia. They all survived. They were captured for about a year because they had a neutral pact with Japan. Eventually, they allowed them to, quote, escape, and they did manage, but they kept the bomber. Russians kept the bomber, but the Americans did manage to escape and eventually found their way back to the United States. Very long journey, but they did find their way back to the United States. So Yamamoto took this very seriously, and he realized how much of a vulnerability the island of Japan still has as long as there are aircraft carriers in the Pacific. So he is going to come up with a very complex battle plan, which is going to take out those 3 aircraft carriers for once and for all. And he's going to select the new battle place to be Midway. But in the meantime, something else is going to happen. Sorry, there it goes. Battle of Coral Sea. So in May of 1942, the Japanese are still threatening Australia. They have bombed Australia starting in February, and now they want to take the Port Moresby. Now, as you can see here, this is New Guinea. This kind of area, Papua New Guinea, is controlled by the British. And the largest city in Papua New Guinea is going to be Port Moresby. And the Japanese have decided that they are going to invade that. At the same time, they're also going to invade an island here in the Solomon Islands known as Tilgini. Again, I pronounced that incorrectly. but it's this tiny little island. So they're going to do 2 invasions at almost the same time. First, they're going to hit is the Solomon Islands, and they also want to hit Port Moresby. Now, once you hit Port Moresby, as you can see kind of on this map, you can now bomb Australia. So you don't need aircraft carriers anymore to bomb Australia. You can now do it from land-based ports, land-based airfields. It's an enormous issue in any sort of war, is whether or not you need to expose your carriers. But if you can do land-based, it's much more effective, especially for the long term. So now on May 1st, 1942, the Japanese task force is going to arrive, and it is going to invade Taligi. Once they are there, they're going to be run across the American carrier USS Yorktown. Now, the USS Yorktown is going to start attacking the ships that are supplying the invasion force here in the Solomon Islands. Now, once they the Japanese realize that the carriers that they're so desperate to get are actually in the Coral Sea, the race is now on to take out their ships. There are 2 carriers in the Coral Sea, and the Japanese are determined to get them both. It doesn't work out that way. On December 8th, 1941, 1 Japanese carrier is damaged, while the carrier USS Lexington is completely sunk. Boom, it's gone. It actually is a very orderly abandonment of the USS Lexington, but it is no longer a force that is available for the Americans. In addition to that, the USS Yorktown is going to be heavily damaged and is going to need to rush back to be repairs at Pearl Harbor. But it works. The Japanese do not attempt to go here and invade Port Moresby. So who won the Battle of Coral Sea? Kind of depends on who you ask. The U.S. lost an aircraft carrier, which was an enormous deal because it was something that was very well needed for the Battle of Midway. On the other hand, they did manage to stop the ambitions of the Japanese, and they did not take Papua New Guinea. Now, in the meantime, they're looking at about a 3-month repair on the USS Yorktown, which has been heavily damaged. So it is on its way back to Pearl Harbor, but it better hurry because it is going to be needed for the Battle of Midway. So let's talk about the Battle of Midway. So who is this gentleman? He's extremely important for the Battle of Midway. Anyone want to put in the chat room who this gentleman is? Nope, not Layton. Very close. Almost. Not Nimitz. Nope, not Spruance. Layton is closer. So if you know who Layton is, you probably know who this gentleman is. Joe. That's correct. No, it's not Fletcher. It's not Bradley. It's actually Joe Rochefort. So who is Joe Rochefort? Joe Rochefort joined the Navy in 1918 while he was still in high school. He was later sent to the naval cryptologist classes and received training in the Japanese language. In 1941, he is stationed in Hawaii. In early 1942, the U.S. is now intercepting and reading about 10% of the Japanese naval code. So sometimes it's as high as 20, but it's about 10. So the Japanese are starting to refer in February of 1942, they're talking about a new target, and they keep on referring to it as AF. What's AF? And Rochefort really believes that it is Midway, but he can't convince anybody it's Midway. So basically, Nimitz says, figure out a way to convince me it is Midway. So one of the solutions they come up with is that they're going to send an uncoded message to Midway talking about water problems. And in return, the Japanese then send out a message saying that there are water problems at AF. We got it. Now we have figured out that there is going to be a very large battle that is going to happen. We know it's going to happen at Midway. We know approximately what date it's going to happen, and we know what ships are going to be involved. And all of that as a result of Rochefort and his unit at the cryptologist. So this is going to be a huge advantage as we enter into the Battle of Midway. So who is this gentleman? Holbrook. That was funny. Correct. This gentleman is, of course, Nimitz. Now, Chester Nimitz is born in Texas and went to the U.S. Naval Academy. Apparently, he wanted to go to West Point, but there weren't any slots available, so he ended up at the Naval Academy. He was a submarine captain in the 1910s, and during the World War, he served under the commander of the U.S. submarine force. In 1939, he led a task force on how to refuel ships at sea. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal, but given the size of the Pacific Ocean, being able to refuel your ships at sea becomes extraordinarily important. So 10 days after Pearl Harbor, he is going to be appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which is, no longer that impressive. When he arrives in Hawaii, the first task is to salvage what he can of the Japanese and to determine what he can do to stop Japanese aggression. He cannot defeat the Japanese. He doesn't have enough to do that. So his only options are to figure out how to stop the aggressions where you can. Now, he's going to be the commander of the Pacific Fleet up until December 2nd, 1945, when he sails into Tokyo Bay and signs the document of surrender aboard the USS Battleship Missouri. So he decides to take an enormous chance, and he is going to rely upon the intelligence that are going to be provided to him by Commander Rochefort, as well as Commander Layton. So Rochefort is the guy who's going to take the information and try to break the code. Layton is going to take that information and try to figure out how to influence military events. So they're a really big, good team, and they have convinced Nimitz that they're the way to go. So now Nimitz is going to go all in. He is going to take this intelligence and he is going to use it to defend Midway. And he is going to risk everything he has on the fact that they are correct. He is going to take what is left of his fleet and he is going to leave Hawaii. He is going to take it to Midway. He's going to leave Hawaii exposed. He's going to leave himself exposed because he's still in Hawaii. And he is going to hope and pray that whatever intelligence information has come from the team of Rochefort and Layton is enough to give him the advantage to save basically the American fleet in the Pacific. So this is it. This is the Midway Atoll. It's 2 islands. I always thought it was 1. It's 2 islands. If you were flying over the Pacific Ocean and you blinked, you would miss this. It is tiny. When the Americans claimed it as their own, basically it was uninhibited. I mean, there was nobody living there. It was just a bunch of birds. But it did have an enormous advantage because it had a really long runway. It was long enough to place a runway. So even before the war started, it was being used as a stopping point. So if you were flying to Japan, or for that matter, China, it's about halfway between San Francisco and Japan. So if you were going to fly to the east, you basically did a stopover at Midway, and it was controlled then by Pan Am, but the U.S. Navy was also putting assets there. So as the war started, Pan Am was out of here, and now it was just controlled by the U.S. Navy. So once they realized that Japan wanted Midway, they basically put everything that they had, which was extremely limited, and they threw it on the island. So suddenly you had the U.S. Navy fortifying the atoll with U.S. Marines, with land-based aircraft, including 17 Army bombers, anti-aircraft fire, barbed wire, anything you can think of. Literally, they had Molotov cocktails. Now, for those of you who know what that is, it's basically a bottle filled with alcohol. You stick a rag in it, you light the rag on fire, and you throw it. That's what they had to basically hold off a Japanese invasion. Molotov cocktails. You really don't believe it until you read it, that that's what they plan to use. So they also then sent the American aircraft carriers. They sent them as well. So you had the island covered with everything they could find, anything that they could do to stop the Japanese. And they also committed what was left of the fleet, which included their 3 aircraft carriers. Nimitz basically took everything that he had and he threw it at Midway. And he had nothing else. He had nothing in reserve. So what was the Japanese battle plan for Midway? Now, the Japanese battle plans are always extremely complicated. The Americans like, the old thing, KISS, which is keep it simple, stupid. The Japanese had very complicated battle plans, and the battle for Midway was even one of the more complicated ones that they came up with. So the question is when did the Americans start fortifying Midway? And it really started in around April. And they thought that the first date, the arrival of the Japanese, would be the end of May. And Nimitz actually went to visit the commanders at Midway Island to tell them that the Japanese were coming and to give him their assurances that they knew they were coming. They were able to fortify with what they had, but even then it wasn't a whole lot. They started fortifying in about April. They thought they were coming the last week in May, and it turns out then they were told kind of at the last minute they have basically one more week, which was an enormous relief because they were able to get more materials in, including those Army bombers, which actually did kind of make a difference in the long run. So here's the Japanese battle plan for Midway. So the first thing they're going to do is they're going to have almost two separate task forces. The first task force is going to be the 4 Japanese carriers. Again, I'm going to pronounce all these names wrong, so I apologize in advance. The Ataki, Saga, Kagi, Surhu, and Haruhu. Oh God, I pronounced those wrong. And I did practice it. They're going to attack Midway, and they're going to destroy the runway. They're going to reduce the forces that are on the ground. So then when the Japanese invasion arrives, they're going to be met with little resistance. And most importantly, they're going to take the Americans completely by surprise. Then they're going to land an invasion force on the Midway. And then once they neutralize the American forces, they're going to rebuild the runway. So then the Japanese planes can actually land on the runway in Midway Island. Then they're going to wait, because the fact that they have now taken Midway Island is going to force the Americans to leave Hawaii and meet them in Midway. And once the American aircraft carriers are going to be in Midway, they're going to destroy the American aircraft carriers. So it's a kind of a two-pronged plan. 1, we're going to take the island. 2, we're going to destroy the aircraft carriers. That is the goal. That is the plan. Now, the second wave of kind of task force is actually going to be the battleships. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. Now, the ship you have here is the Yamamoto, which is Yamamoto's battleship, which is his flagship for this battle. So let's talk about the Japanese advantages as we go into the Battle of Midway, and there are a lot. So they have a much larger naval fleet. They have 4 fleet carriers. They have 2 battleships. They have 2 cruisers. They've got 1 light cruiser, 12 destroyers, 248 aircraft, and they got 13 submarines. That's a serious battle fleet, and it is ready for action. They also have better technology. Now, they have been at war basically since 1931. The Japanese have invested a lot of money into the latest technology. The Japanese Zero, for example, is literally the best fighter in the Pacific. The Americans have nothing that even matches it slightly. So they have better technology. They have a larger fleet, and their pilots are much more experienced. Most of the pilots who were involved in the Battle of Midway were also part of that bombed Pearl Harbor. So they have experience. They were either at Pearl Harbor and or Coral Sea, or most of them both. So you've got experienced pilots. They know what they're doing. They're used to flying with each other. They know the formations. They know battle tactics. They're experienced pilots. In addition to that, the idea that the Japanese were used to winning. The Japanese have been winning since 1931. This is 10 years later. They really start believing that they are invincible. And once you start believing that, it really spreads. It's the momentum idea. They have the momentum, the Americans do not. And also, they are able to choose the battle place and time. The Americans are totally on the defensive. They're on the offensive, and being on the offensive gives you some advantages. More importantly, you can choose the location, you can choose the time, and you can choose who you're sending. The Americans basically have to send what they have left. So what is the American battle plan? Survive. That's it. That's their whole strategy. We're just not going to lose. That's really the strategy. That's the thought process as they go into it. What is our big plan? Don't lose. So their plan is to stop the Japanese invasion force from taking Midway. They also want to destroy the Japanese task force, but really with the emphasis of taking out their aircraft carriers. And almost more importantly than anything else, preserve what is left of the Pacific Fleet. If they lose the Pacific Fleet, they're going to have to abandon Hawaii and they're going to have to go back to the West Coast, which means they can't help Australia and they're just going to have to concede the entire Pacific Ocean to the Japanese. So in June of 1942, what did the Americans have? What was their fleet? Well, it wasn't so bad. It had 3 U.S. air carriers, the USS Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, and they had 233 aircraft on board. They also had 7 cruisers. They had 1 light cruiser, 15 destroyers, 16 submarines, along with 127 aircraft based at Midway. Now that sounds pretty good on paper, but when you kind of start breaking it down, it's not that great. Again, most of the pilots have never seen battle. Most of the cruisers were built in the 1920s. We're not talking about new cruisers. We're not talking about new ships. The submarines are really old, and most of the aircraft that are based on Midway are unbelievably old. So really the idea, and the interesting thing that I saw on a special I watched was that the night before the battle, the American pilots on the aircraft carriers were told to write a letter to their families. In other words, this is the letter that gets sent after you die. So they know what this means. Most of those pilots leave that aircraft believing most of them are not coming back. So let's talk about the timeline for the battle. So June 3rd, there's this little skirmish, but not much happens. It's really on June 4th that the battle starts in earnest. So at 4:30 a.m., the Japanese launch aircraft using land-based bombs from the 4 carriers to attack Midway Island. 5:30 in the morning, the U.S. patrol crafts picks up the task force and the incoming aircraft. The U.S. scrambles all aircraft from Midway. They've been waiting for this. They've been training for this. They get all 226 aircraft in the air as quickly as possible. Then you have this fighter escort or fighter cap, they call it. Basically, they call it a combat air patrol, kind of over the island. And the Japanese go through it like paper. And the initial attack, basically most of the fighters get shot down by the incoming Zeros. They really don't survive. But the initial attack doesn't do as much damage as they had anticipated. And for example, the runway is still operational. You know, there's still a lot of Marines running around. They really are not yet ready for an invasion force. So the idea is that they're really going to need a second attack on Midway Island before they send in the Japanese Marines to take the island. So back on the Japanese aircraft carriers, they're going to start arming the reserve aircraft that they have with land-based bombs for another attack on Midway. At the same time, remember, the Americans are sitting outside of Midway. They hear the attack has occurred on Midway. They launch all of their aircraft basically bound for the Japanese aircraft carriers. So at 7:55, the U.S. aircraft send out from the SSS Enterprise and Hornet for the Japanese task force, and the Yorktown sends it about an hour later. So at 8 p.m., there's new confusion. 8 p.m., the Japanese patrol aircraft reports that it has spotted the U.S. the U.S. task force. The Japanese are like, what are you talking about? They're not here yet. They're going to wait until they hear about what happened Midway, and then they're going to show up in a couple of days after we've taken Midway. What do you mean they're already here? This completely throws off the Japanese battle plan. So instead of now basically figuring out whether or not we're going to bomb Midway again, we can't bomb Midway. We have to take out the aircraft carriers. Now, this is going to happen a few days before it was planned, but either way, they're the most important target. If we take out the aircraft carriers, we can get Midway later. So now we're going to do this switch. So instead of arming aircraft in order to launch against Midway, we are going to change the bombs, and we are going to change the bombs so they basically can be used to attack the aircraft carriers. So when all of this is going on around 8:10, there's this confusion kind of on the Japanese as to whether or not we're going to bomb Midway or we're going to go after the aircraft carriers. Suddenly bombers appear. So there are US bombers that from Midway that have found the Japanese task force, and they are starting to bomb the Japanese aircraft carriers. They don't get very far. They're actually mostly shot down by the Japanese Zeros, who basically have the CAP, which is the Combat Air Patrol, which basically surrounds the Japanese carriers. And then something weird is going to happen. There's this huge, we talked about the size of the fleet, and into the middle of this huge fleet, a US submarine arrives. And it is the Dauntless. And the Dauntless has somehow found the Japanese task force, and it has decided that if it is going to break cover and it is going to attack it, it wants a battleship. We're not fooling around with a little destroyer. If we're going to, expose ourselves, we want something bigger. And it actually fires several torpedoes, but they don't make it. They miss. So now they're exposed. Now they're being depth charged. They're out of here. So the Nautilus basically pulls out of the task force and is trying to escape. And one Japanese destroyer is going to be sent after it. That's very important. It's going to be important later. So now at about 9:10, all of the Japanese aircraft that have bombed Midway Island have to make their way back to their carriers. Now they have to land, they have to be refueled, and they have to be armed, obviously, instead of we're going back to Midway, they're now going after the US air carriers. So there's all of these different they've got different, basically everything is strewed. So if you think about all the different decks on an aircraft carrier, every deck has a plane on it, every deck has bombs on it, every deck has fuel on it. And in the middle of all of this, 41 US torpedo planes are going to arrive. And they're going to come in from 3 different carriers. So first you're going to have 15 from the USS Hornet, and then almost immediately following that, you're going to have 14 from the USS Enterprise. And then 30 minutes after that, you're going to have 12 planes from Yorktown. And they are all going to attack in not coordinated, but kind of one at a time. They're going to come in and they're going to try to attack the Japanese task force. And they're going to do it without fighter cover. Now, the assumption was at the time by the navies that if you wanted to take out a ship, you use torpedo planes. Not so much. It seemed like that would be the way to take out a plane. I mean, the Japanese did it when they took out the HMS Prince of Wales. So here's the problem with this. So here's a Japanese ship. It's like this, so it's a little taller, maybe like that. And so now you've got to have an aircraft coming at us. So the aircraft is going to come in low. It's going to come in slow. It's going to drop its bomb and then try to take off. It's going at less than 100 miles an hour. The Japanese, fighters have a field day. So between the Japanese fighters, the anti-aircraft, most of the torpedo planes don't even launch their torpedoes. If they do manage to launch their torpedoes, the torpedoes malfunction and they fail to explode. So all 41 planes, basically, none of them make any impact on that fleet at all. But what it does do is that any aircraft that actually manages to escape, drops their ordnance and then tries to go back to it, is going to be chased now by the Japanese Zeros. So it was going to pull the Japanese cover away from the aircraft carriers and is now going to leave them vulnerable. And at almost the exact same time, you are going to have 3 different squadrons of dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and Yorktown. Now they're looking for the task force. They can't find it. They're running out of fuel. They have to go back. And there's this whole discussion as to whether or not they go back because they just don't have any more fuel left. when out of nowhere, the commander, Wade McCluskey, happens to see the Japanese destroyer who was chasing the US, let me go back here a slide, who happened to be chasing the Nautilus. He's now given up his chase of the Nautilus and is making his way back to the task force. So just by sheer happenstance, McCluskey sees in this huge ocean this one destroyer who is speeding his way back towards the task force. Now he could be speeding his way away from the task force. McCluskey just on happenstance, on a hunch, basically decides to go ahead and follow that destroyer in the hopes that it will lead him to the task force. And it does. I am so sorry. This is basically the government announcing that, you know, we have a possible tornado, so there's nothing I can do to shut it off. My TV is literally off and it's still going off. I'm so sorry about that.
Deirdre, it sounds like part of the program, like man your battle stations.
It's like I timed it.
I thought it was part of the program. I was like, wow, that's a cool
No,
sound.
it wasn't.
We would have never known.
Sorry. It's a thunderstorm warning.
No apologies necessary.
Okay. So McCluskey is following this destroyer and it leads him back to the task force. In the meantime, all the Zeros have left their aircraft carriers and are following the leftover torpedo planes. You couldn't make this any better if you tried. At 10:22, 3 dive bomber squadrons find 4 Japanese aircraft carriers without support and with every deck on that aircraft covered with aircraft, bombs, and fuel. You couldn't, if you wrote this, nobody would believe you. It is the set of circumstances are just too unusual, too happenstance, too luck, to whatever you want to call it, to actually have happened this way. But this is literally how it did it. Okay, I think we're done. All right, so the first, please tell me you're done. Please be done. All right, I think we're done. So the Akagi is the first to get hit. After 2 squadrons, basically they're supposed to hit different aircraft. There's some confusion, kind of every squadron decides to go after one carrier. And so 2 different squadrons from the USS Enterprise from 2 different directions managed to hit the one aircraft carrier at the same time. So Lieutenant Best, who is one of the really good pilots with the USS Enterprise, manages to see that everybody's going after the same aircraft carrier. So he basically pulls out of his dive, he and his 2 wingmen, and they switch and they move over to the Akagi. So they're going to leave the first aircraft carrier, they're going to go after the second one. So if you've ever seen the movie Midway, they really lay this out really well. So what a dive bomber is going to do is it's going to start as high as it can and try to pick up speed by going straight down at that aircraft. At the rate in which he is going, he really can't, they have a hard time shooting at him because he's going so fast and he's moving, but you also have to plan it perfectly because the ship is moving and the ship is, you know, weaving to try to avoid. So you're coming down, the ship is moving. And once you go into that dive, you almost can't pull out until you drop that aircraft. So you're going at about 150, 180 miles an hour. You're going straight down, you drop your bomb, and then you've got to figure out how to pull out in time before you go into the aircraft carrier. He pulls it off. So my friend Lieutenant Best and his 2 wingmen, they attack the Akagi. 1 bomb, most likely from Lieutenant Best, manages to provide the blow. So 1 bomb alone, so about 4 hit the Akagi. 1 bomb hits 4 bombs hit the Nagi. Akagi is hit by 1 bomb, and it's most likely from Lieutenant Best. So again, at the exact same time, you then have planes from the USS Yorktown that are commanded by Lieutenant Leslie. They're going to hit the Isoroku with 3 different bombs, at least 3 different bombs. Within 6 minutes of the start of the attack, 3 aircraft carriers are ablaze and will all eventually be scuttled. 6 minutes. That's how long it takes to sink 3 aircraft carriers. because they happen to hit it at the absolute perfect time. There's no aircraft cover, and the entire decks are strewn with bombs, fuel, and airplanes. That's all it takes to basically turn the war on its head. 6 minutes. Now, planes from the USS Yorktown are going to hit the Hiroki, but they're actually going to all miss, and that aircraft carrier is going to survive the initial attack. Now, a lot of the planes managed to drop their bombs, but they're running out of fuel, and they're going to have to ditch in the ocean before they ever make it back. So again, there are a few that are going to be hit by anti-aircraft carrier. There are a few that are going to be taken out by fighters who come back and then try to chase the dive bombers. But most of the bombers that we lose on that day are going to be because they run out of fuel. So what happens next? So this is all before 9 o'clock, all before 10:30 in the morning. So at 11 o'clock in the morning, the planes from the surviving Japanese aircraft carrier Haruku, they're going to try to find the USS carriers. They managed to find the USS Yorktown. So the Yorktown is going to get hit by 3 different bombs, and it is heavily damaged. However, 1 hour later, the crew manages to get most of the fires out. They have patched up the deck, and they have restored power. So the Yorktown is out running again, even though it has been heavily damaged by 3 different bombs. So at 2:30 in the afternoon, planes again from that same aircraft carrier Hiroki are going to find the USS Yorktown again. This time it's going to get hit with 2 torpedoes. It's going to lose all power, and it's going to tilt to port. The Japanese assume that they have now sunk 2 carriers because they've hit the same carrier twice. The first time they left, the carrier was on fire. They came back, and it was a different carrier because it was no longer on fire. In fact, it was basically just the same carrier. So the Japanese are assuming at the end of the day that they have taken out 2 aircraft carriers when in fact they've just hit the same one twice. That's kind of the last of them. By 5 p.m., the Hiroko is going to be found by planes from the USS Enterprise and whatever is left from the USS Yorktown. Now, this time, the Zero fighters are there. They have the combat control over the aircraft. So everybody's going to come in. There's going to be fighter aircraft. There's going to be dive bombers. And they're all going to hit this one aircraft carrier. And they still managed to sink it. So even though they don't have the same luck that they had last time, which is, no fighter planes, everything's going to be strewn. This time, the Japanese are ready for them. The fighters are there waiting for them. They don't have the problems with the ordnance. And yet the Americans still managed to drop at least 4 bombs on the Hiroki. She is going to be abandoned. And by the next day, she will sink. So now what started that morning, 4:30 in the morning, when they launched aircraft to 5 p.m. at night, 12-hour period, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers are gone. So the next day is kind of a letdown. So June 5th, the US planes will take off from the USS Enterprise and Hornet, and they're going to try to hit survivors, any ship that's still available. They really don't find anything the first day. And then finally on the 6th, they're able to sink another cruiser. Now, when all of this is going on June 5th, you have the task force is going to arrive. Now, the task force is what includes Yamamoto in his battleship. Now, they're basically behind a storm front, so they kind of come in behind the storm front, and they realize what has happened, and they've lost all their air cover. And they have this great big brand new battleship, and it is vulnerable now to an American attack from aircraft. Basically, Yamamoto decides it's time to retire. So he starts pulling his task force away from Midway back to Japan. In the meantime, the USS Yorktown just won't sink. So it has been abandoned. It has been hit twice in one day, and yet it's still floating. So they actually send a crew back onto the USS Yorktown. They are able to start doing repairs. They bring in a USS destroyer, the Hanman, and they actually supply electrical power. And they're actually trying to figure out how to get the ship underway again. And it looks like the USS Yorktown may survive yet another day until it is hit by a Japanese submarine. So a Japanese submarine hits both the Yorktown as well as the destroyer Hanman. So they both go down. So finally, almost 2 days after it was hit, on June 7th, the USS Yorktown turns onto her port side, exposes the hull from the submarine, and then finally sinks beneath the waves. On June 10th, the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet are going to head back to Pearl Harbor. They're done. So what happened in the end? So what are the losses? So the first thing that's going to happen is the Americans have lost the USS Yorktown, and they have lost a destroyer, the USS Hammond, who was there to try to get the Yorktown up and running again. 150 aircraft are going to be destroyed. 307 are going to be killed, including 3 prisoners. So the Japanese do find several downed airmen in the sea, and they are killed by the Japanese. The Japanese losses include all 4 of their carriers. 1 heavy cruiser is destroyed. 1 heavy cruiser is badly damaged. 248 aircraft are destroyed. That means 3,057 are killed and 37 are captured. Yeah, I know, I do that. I mispronounce names. I apologize. So someone was commenting about the fact that I mispronounced the Japanese names, and I do. So I apologize for that. So let's talk about the impact of the battle. So why is this so important? If at the end of the day, the Japanese still have 2 carriers and we have 2 carriers, why is this considered such a lopsided battle? The first thing it does is it stops the Japanese advance in the Pacific cold. They will be no longer have they will have no longer have air superiority, and they will basically stop any additional territory. They really have lost their ability to continue expanding their empire. So the Americans have basically stopped the Japanese cold. It also shows the importance of cryptology. For reasons that I still to this day do not understand, the Japanese still don't understand that we have broken their code. So even though the American aircraft is waiting for them at Midway, it is perfectly clear to the Japanese that there has been reinforcements of Midway Island. They still don't believe that their code has been broken. So it really emphasized the importance of cryptology, and it emphasized the importance of intelligence battling. Now, after the battle, the US has 2 carriers. The Japanese have 2 carriers. Why does it matter that the Americans only have 2 carriers? By the end of the war, guess how many carriers the United States is going to have? Sorry, I can't see it. So if you were going to guess, so somebody probably already knows because people know more than I do. So if you were going to guess how many carriers the United States Navy had at the end of in September of 1945, how many would you think it would be? Nope, not 199, not 11, somewhere in between. A lot more than 10. '99. September of 1945, the United States had 99 U.S. aircraft carriers. Now, not all of them were fleet size, some of them were escort, but they had 99. The Japanese could only build 1 more fleet carrier. They built 2 light carriers, and then they built 2 other carriers that really were just ineffective. So 3 years after Midway, they had only built 5. We had built 95. The industrial output of the United States was such that the Japanese were in a race of time, and they didn't know it. The Americans didn't know it because the Americans didn't think we could build that much that fast. So again, you had this huge disparity of industrial output between the Japanese and the Americans. And after the Battle of Midway, that really became an enormous factor in the battle for the Pacific Ocean. It also was the end of the Japanese technological superiority. when we started building aircraft, or both aircraft and the next generation aircraft and ships really came online in 1943. And that was the end of the Japanese superiority. Technologically, we surpassed them. We surpassed them with their fighter aircraft, with our Dauntless aircraft. Every aircraft we had, every ship that we're building were superior to what the Japanese were able to build. It also was the end of the Japanese pilot superiority. Most of the pilots that were used at Pearl Harbor were gone by the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway pilots who survived were then transferred back to the United States to start teaching the next group coming through. So they were able to take the knowledge that they had and experience and teach it to the next group of pilots coming through. So in theory, they were taking that knowledge and spreading it. So when they finally faced the Japanese again, really not until 44, both the pilot superiority and the technology superiority was painfully obvious. So nobody really understood at the time. Sorry, Robert, you had a question? Robert, you have your hand raised and you're on mute.
Oh no, I'm fine. Sorry,
okay.
I must have clicked that by accident. Sorry.
So let's say that the Americans had lost Midway. What would have happened next? This is why it's such a turning point. If the Americans had lost Midway, then the Japanese would have had an island that they could bomb Hawaii. And if they could bomb Hawaii, that made the aircraft carriers in Hawaii now vulnerable. So they probably would have had to pull back the aircraft carriers from Hawaii back to the West Coast. If they had pulled them back to the West Coast, they probably would have taken the fleet with them. So they would have abandoned Hawaii, they would have abandoned Australia, and there is a decent chance that the Americans would have sued for peace because they would have realized that perhaps they were better off going after the Germans and then kind of leaving the Japanese for another war and not trying to do both at the same time. Instead, they won the Battle of Midway, and it was the beginning of the forcing of the Japanese as they started losing territory after territory until they went back to Japan. And that kind of ends my presentation. We really kind of started with the Battle of Pearl Harbor, but we're going to end it right here at Midway because it is the turning point. And kind of what happens after that is the beginning of the end for the Japanese. People really don't know that until after the war ends, how pivotal this battle really was. And I probably missed a bunch of questions along the way. So if anyone has any, I'd be happy to try to answer them. And I went over again. I really thought that I had so many few slides that I would be finished quicker than that. Hate it when that happens.
Deirdre, we love it when that happens because then we learn more stuff. We get our, we want to make sure everyone gets our money's worth. So thanks, Deirdre. If anyone has a question that wasn't answered yet, why don't you put it in the chat in the Q&A and we can go through from there.
I know that a lot of people know more about this topic than I do. One of the things that I do try to do is kind of take the basic ideas and not try to delve into too much details, because then you kind of lose people who are not as familiar with it. So I keep on trying to do it at the 1,000-foot level instead of bearing down into the details. Thank you. I appreciate that. Again, I did the first presentation on this, I want to say when I was 14, a freshman in high school. So I'm very familiar with the topic. I think I got an A on that one. It was a long time ago.
You got an A on this one also.
Thank you.
And again, if you joined us late or didn't see this in the first part, this is actually the third program that Deirdre has done for us online. The first one was about a little over a month ago. It was called The Great War, Rise and Fall of Empires from 1914 to 1918, sorry. And the recording of that's on our YouTube channel. I posted the link in the chat. I'll post it again. It was also in the Zoom information that was sent out. And then last year, she did the Pentagon 9/11 Memorial virtual tour of that site. So if you want to check those out, you are free to do so. And then again, if you have any questions you can get answered yet or anything else that popped up, feel free to type those in the chat for the Q&A. As a reminder, we have some other programs that are coming up while the questions are coming in. So on Friday night and Saturday morning, we're going to stream The Longest Day, this classic, iconic World War II film. It's actually going to use the same exact Zoom link as tonight's program. So just hold on to that. And if you want to sign up for it, you're more than welcome to. If you haven't signed up, don't worry about it. Just use the same Zoom link and come join us. And then also this Saturday, our friend Harry Phillips is having an in-person tour of Arlington National Cemetery that's going to focus on D-Day, and that takes place at 10 o'clock. That sign up for that's on our meetup site. I'll also email out the information for that if you want to join us. And I'm currently splitting my time between Texas and the East Coast. So we've started doing in-person events in Texas. So like, for instance, last weekend in Dallas, we went to the John F. Kennedy assassination site. We went to the George W. Bush Museum. We went to a bunch of art museums, going to a lot of other things coming up in the near future. If you want to join us for that, you can find us on meetup.com. And the name of our site for that is Dallas History and Culture. I'll post a link for that as well in the chat.
Robert, there were a few questions that came in. I'm going to try to answer.
Oh, yeah,
the one was the number of forces involved, and the answer is in the tens of thousands. I apologize, I don't know the exact, but if you think about each aircraft carrier, it's about 1,000 people on board, you know, the big battleships. So we are talking about several tens of thousands. I would say 20 to 30,000 on each side who were involved in this battle. Most of them did survive, but most of the people who were lost were the pilots, and the air crews were lost. And then the other question is when was the Japanese code broken? It's a little confusing because there are two different codes. The first one is the diplomatic code, and that was broken probably in mid-1940s. So they were able to read the diplomatic messages going from Tokyo to Washington, D.C. They were going to the Japanese ambassador. So those were broken pretty early. And then the naval code was more complicated, and that really wasn't broken. Broken is not even the right word. They were able to intercept anywhere between 10 to 20% of that come February 1942, and they just got better at it as it went on. The third question is, are you planning to do a 9/11 tour? And the answer is yes, but again, not until September. So I hope I answered those questions. There are probably more that came in, but those are the ones I saw at the end.
Deirdre, how did you initially get interested in this topic? You mentioned that you did this first program.
At 14 years old, I had to do a history project, and I ended up taking a cardboard paper or cardboard, and I spray painted it, and then I created the island of Midway, and then I bought little ships to show the aircraft carriers, and then put dots on it to show that they were sunk. It was it was very complicated. But I did get an A, and it's a very complicated battle because the battle basically starts in February of 42 once they are able to identify the fact that it is Midway, and then kind of all the strategies that led to those 6 minutes in which they managed to take out 3 aircraft carriers.
Yeah, it's really amazing how much things changed in such a short period of time. Someone asked earlier, what did you think of the 2 movies, the one from the 70s and the more recent one? I saw the one from the movies when I was a kid, and I thought it was really cool. And then I saw it again a few years ago, and I thought it left a little bit sucked. I thought it was kind of corny. And then I actually haven't seen the more recent one. Have you seen either of those 2 films, Deirdre?
Yes, I've seen them both.
What did you think?
1976 was basically, the movie was made in 1976, which was immediately following the Tora Tora movie. So it kind of followed that same idea. It took actors that were kind of famous in the 50s, and they threw them into this movie, but they didn't spend a lot of money on kind of the action shots. So that's kind of why they threw in the romance and some other things. But I thought it did tell a pretty good tale of Rochefort and him breaking the code and that importance. So in that sense, I thought is pretty good for its time.
Yeah, it
I
did a good
really
job kind of
like,
capturing the essence of the battle, I thought. But
yeah.
the love story thing I thought was pretty cheap.
I thought, yeah, me too. But the 2019 movie, I was very excited about. I really thought they did a really good job. They focused really on the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise and the pilots involved, including Lieutenant Best. And I think that because they really didn't find any aircraft that they could use, they did it all CGI, which sometimes just, it worked. You were in that aircraft and you were attacking those aircraft carriers. And it really highlights Dick Best and what he did. It makes him into kind of the hero of the movie. And in some ways, he was the hero of the battle. So there is debate whether or not he really sunk 2 or 1. He definitely sunk 1. Whether he sunk the other is up for debate. But I really thought that they did a really good job of focusing in on one character, one person's experience, and how that led to the enormous shift in world events in those 6 minutes.
Okay, very good. What about another question from earlier? Did people know the significance of this at the time, or did it take a while? I mean, obviously, a lot of carriers were lost. Now this is one of the real monumental events of World War II. Did it kind of seem that way at the time as well?
They certainly were. I mean, Nimitz couldn't believe that they had managed to sink 4. That was beyond his wildest imaginations of what the Americans could pull off at that time. So they did understand the significance. I mean, they only had 6. And the fact that they managed to take out 4 of them in one day, that's a significant. And it was a significant at the time. The fact that did they know it was the turning point? No. They really didn't realize later because they didn't understand nobody really understood at the time the industrial output that the United States could produce. When Roosevelt said we were going to produce, I think it was 10,000 planes a month, everybody thought he was crazy. I think they were producing at one point 15,000 planes a month. So it was the output that the Americans could produce was so beyond anyone's ideas that they really didn't understand that the Japanese and the Americans were in a race of time, and the Japanese had already lost.
So they go into the battle. The Japanese have 6 aircraft carriers. The United States have 3. So they're outnumbered 2-1. And when the battle's over and the dust settles, Japan has 2 and the United States has 2, and they're pretty much even. And then from then on forward, the industrial.
But the difference is that the Americans can produce 99, and the Japanese can't.
That's really an incredible statistic.
It really is. Like, I read that, I had to read it twice. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, because that's like one coming off the assembly line, like 2 a month, or I guess every couple of weeks.
Actually, they really didn't even start coming off the line until 43.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. So it really happened that fast. I mean, at one point, not only were we building 99 aircraft carriers, but we were building 3 Liberty ships a day, on top of the aircraft carriers and the battleships and everything else we were producing.
Mm-hmm.
While we had 16 million men in uniform.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the numbers are just astounding.
I saw an article, it was for the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor last year, and it talked about how Pearl Harbor in Japan is a very different topic, because while it's a very monumental event in the United States, it was just kind of one of a series of events. You did a really great job kind of talking about all the other places that they were invading and all the other things that they were doing. But Midway, I would think, would still have to be a pretty significant event for them, just because it's a real turning point on the downside for them.
Well, it's like everything else, the Americans are still grappling with the American Civil War, and that was 150 years ago. So, the idea that different countries and how they deal with war and how they come to understand and how it's written, it's still always changing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, U.S. and Vietnam and other things.
Correct.
Talking about what the implications are of Afghanistan and et cetera, et cetera. So we're just chatting kind of amongst ourselves. If you have any questions or comments before we wrap things up, feel free to type those in the chat or the Q&A.
The one question that everybody has is the woking the sleeping giant. There's no real evidence that Yamamoto ever said that.
Yeah.
It's a great quote, and it's a I wish he had, but I wish I could find real solid evidence that he did in fact say that. But
Yeah, when I
was
researched that, it seemed like that was the essence of what he believed, that he never actually said that.
correct.
But that's the danger of getting your history from the films.
Yeah. But it certainly did awake the greatest generation. The greatest generation included, everything from the 16 million men who went into uniform, 16 million people, mostly men, who went into uniform, to the women who went into the factories, to the people who left the farm to go into living in places they never lived before so they could work in these factories. The industrial output was amazing.
Mm-hmm. So if this was the big turning point for we're a United States or American-based organization, if this was the big turning point in the Pacific War, what would you say the big turning point in the other theater was? Was it D-Day or before that? Or
no, it was Stalin. Personally, I believe it's Stalingrad.
But what about like on the other front, like for the Americans and the British and
the war, if you take the two different wars, you've got the European War and you've got the Pacific War. The turning point of the Pacific War was Midway. The turning point of the European War would be at Stalingrad. Mm-hmm. At Stalingrad, basically the Germans were moving forward, and then they were stuck cold at Stalingrad. Mm-hmm. And then after that, it was just a matter of going back to the original boundaries, and they were mm-hmm. pushed basically from both sides. They were mm-hmm. pushed first by the Russians and then eventually by the Americans. You could say that the question is which was the turning point? Was it Sicily? Was it Italy? Or was it D-Day? And the answer is yes.
All the above.
Correct. But where the Germans basically stopped their advance and they really didn't go any further, that was Stalingrad.
Mm-hmm. Pretty amazing. And then 80 years ago.
Yeah. And the battle occurred on the June 4th, 6th, and the June 4th, 5th, and 6th. But the major thing occurred on the 4th. The sinking of the 4 ships was on the 4th.
Yeah, and the date's not as remembered as well. I mean, like for World War II, everyone just remembers like Pearl Harbor Day,
Pearl Harbor and D-Day,
VED, and VJ
yes.
Day. That's pretty much
correct.
Unfortunately. Well, hopefully this program changes that and people will now remember this date moving forward.
That's a very good point. Somebody talked about the Germans' inability to invade Britain. And is that considered a turning point in the war? The answer is yes, that certainly was a turning point in the war. But the question is did the Germans really want England in the first place?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, our British friends would probably say the Battle of Britain was the turning point.
Yeah, and they certainly have a point. And, historians will be arguing this for the end of time. But if you read the Mein Kampf, which is what Hitler wrote before the war, he was always interested in what he called living space. And living space was always in the East. So he always was interested in taking the German Empire and moving it into the East. So I feel he was always going to go after Germany, and the fact that Britain just kind of fell, it was, icing on the cake. Mm-hmm. But that's my feeling. Again, you have different historians who will absolutely argue different points, and all of them are valid.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, very good.
Yes.
Is there anything at Midway anymore? Do you know? Because I never heard of like tourists going or anything.
Very good question. It's very, very small. There really aren't even any hotels. It used to be controlled by the U.S. Navy. It has now been turned over to the U.S. Interior Department. And they do allow visas, but they're very few in numbers. And most of the time people are going there to basically study birds.
Okay. Because I never hear anything about anybody going to Midway.
Correct. It's now considered a wildlife refuge.
Okay. All right, we'll just go to Pearl Harbor instead. Some of these other places.
It was funny. I was talking to my brother-in-law, who's also a historian buff, and we were talking about kind of where we were going to visit next. I said, let's go to New Orleans so I can go to the World War II Museum. We'll just leave them home, and the two of us will go.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome museum. So there's a guy in our group that actually is a docent there. And he said if I organized a trip to the World War II Museum, he would give us a tour. So I was like, oh, heck yeah, we'll do that. I just had to figure out the date. So it won't be like in the next month or two. But yeah, at some point in time, I've been to the World War II Museum myself a couple of times. It's really amazing. So that would be a great site to visit for anyone that's still listening that hasn't been to that yet.
So somebody wrote
There's
something
also
very
a
cute.
nice museum
No.
in Texas. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, somebody wrote in the chat, is it possible that Tom Hanks' friend Wilson, does he live on Midway? I thought that was pretty clever.
Yeah, and I saw someone like it was a wildlife refuge. But
Yes.
There's also a nice museum in Fredericksburg, Texas, which is west of Austin. It's called the Museum of the Pacific War, I think. And I think that's Nimitz's hometown. And so that's also worth checking out. John Barry mentioned that Midway is a wildlife refuge. So thanks, John. Appreciate that.
Yes.
And let's see if anything else. But yeah, the World War II Museum, we'll schedule a trip there someday, and then our friend can give us a tour.
Yes, that would be great.
Let's see. Ellen says the Japanese should have known the dive bombers were coming, yet all the Zeros were down at the water level chasing the torpedo planes. They seem pretty reckless to me. Yeah, so this is one of the fascinating aspects of this battle. There's so many decisions that were made, and a lot of like, oh, maybe they should have done this, or this was a lucky break, or it really could have gone a lot of different ways. It really makes this battle fascinating.
It really is. And, a slight change in the weather and suddenly the whole battle is different as well. If the torpedo planes had waited for, if they had waited for the fighter planes, some of them may have survived, but then if they survived, then the fighter planes may not have been pulled away. So it's all, it all builds one on top of the other, and a slight change in any of it changes the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what also makes it interesting. If McCluskey had said, you know what, I'm running out of fuel, it's time to go home, he would not. There's a very good chance that the Japanese would have found the American carriers first.
Yeah, this battle's like the classic example of it being a chess game and the different moves and how you react. Luck plays a part in things. Let's see. Gary asked a question. Speaking of luck, Gary asked, as the Pacific War progressed, what airplane became the most influential for the Americans? I'm assuming that the Japanese really did not progress beyond the Zeros. For the American side, in my opinion, just seemed there wasn't really one, because they kept kind of surpassing one another. But the Mustang was, and then of course
the Mustang was an excellent aircraft that came about, I want to say either late 42 or early 43. But that really changed the battlefield. But the Dauntless dive bomber, the future of naval aviation was supposed to be the torpedo plane. So what money the Americans were putting into naval aviation, it went into the torpedo plane, and it was a complete waste of time and money because it was completely unsuccessful at the Battle of Midway. The dive bomber was almost an afterthought. And yet that was the bomber, or the aircraft that actually took out the four aircraft carriers. So the technology, it's not that the technology was better. The pilots it was everything. It was luck. The pilots were very good. They had practiced. They knew what they were doing. But the aircraft themselves they had was not superior. It really came down to the ability of the pilots.
Yeah, and about 9 or 10 months later, Yamamoto got killed.
Correct. Because of our ability. Because of the code. Because of our ability to read Japanese codes, we found out he was doing an inspection tour, and we managed to find his aircraft and take the aircraft out. And it was one of the first times the Japanese were told that something bad had happened. So that when Yamamoto was killed, he was given a public and very national funeral, and it was covered in the media. So it was kind of the first indication that the Japanese people had that the war wasn't going well when their commander of their naval fleet was killed.
Yeah, when the top guy gets killed, that's not a good sign.
Correct.
So here, I'll share.
It's usually not a good indication it's going well.
I reposted some of the comments in the chat. So Dennis wrote, "Sleeping Giant" line written by script writer for Tor. Heard it from producer. Let's see. Naomi says, "The World War II Museum is fabulous. I want to go back." Tracy says, "The D-Day Museum in New Orleans is excellent." So they built the museum there because I think the guy that invented the Higgins boat was from New Orleans. I think that's why it's there.
Yes.
Carlo
yes,
says the museum in
yeah.
Fredericksburg. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Deirdre?
One of the questions was, did I hear you correctly? The Japanese killed their pilots that failed, the ones they picked up in the ocean. No, they killed the American pilots that they found. So the Japanese managed to pick up that we know of, managed to pick up 3 American downed pilots. And as from what we understand, that they killed all 3 of them. They weren't pilots. One of them was an airman, but they did manage to pick up 3 crew members who were downed pilots. They managed to bail out. They were in the ocean. They were found by the Japanese, and the Japanese killed them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not in dispute.
Okay.
One of the questions was, is the Japanese in total denial over their codes being cracked? Basically, I think so. I think the Japanese were in denial. They really thought their codes were that good.
Yeah, all these unsung heroes in this battle.
Correct. Everything from Rochefort and his code breakers, from the pilots to the pilots of the dive bombers, to the pilots in the torpedo planes, to the ones who made it back and the ones who didn't.
Carlo in Texas also says the museum in Fredericksburg is a really awesome place to visit. So check that out.
One of the questions came in, did they change their code periodically throughout the war? The answer is yes. Actually, they changed the code right before Midway, which really scared the Americans because they were right as Midway started. I want to say like the end of May, they did change the codes. So for that last few days before the Midway strike, if the Japanese had made any changes, the Americans would not have picked it up. Luckily for the Americans, they did not make any changes before the Battle of Midway. So they really had an idea as to where they were going, how many ships were going to be there before the battle began. Very good question.
And then the museum that we were talking about, oops, hold on. The official name of the museum that we were talking about is called the National Museum of the Pacific War. It's in Fredericksburg, Texas, which is a little over an hour west of Austin, Texas, as a FYI. Has a 5-star rating on TripAdvisor, which is almost unheard of. So there you go. Okay, if there's no other questions, I think that's a wrap for our...
I think I've talked enough.
Oh no, I could listen to this for... If you said this was halftime, you were going to come back and talk about the
somebody
rest of the
did
war.
ask questions.
Okay with me.
I apologize. Somebody asked questions about the attack on the at Alaska. That I wanted to add that, then I thought that that's just too confusing, so I didn't. They also sent 2 carriers, light carriers, they're called escort carriers, to Alaska to hit a place called Dutch Harbor. So they bombed Dutch Harbor, and then they actually landed in 2 of the islands off of the Aleutian Islands. It was basically a feint to try to get the Americans to release their carriers from Hawaii because we've attacked, quote unquote, the American mainland. But the Americans knew they were going there, and they just let them, realizing that eventually they would resolve it. And they did, because the Japanese were unable to supply the troops that they landed in Alaska. And eventually the Americans did take the islands back. Very good question. I apologize. I tried to add it, and then I'm like, this is just too confusing. If anyone asks, I know the answers.
Oh, no, it's okay. It's all good.
One of the other questions was, is the USS Yorktown the same ship that is in Charleston? The answer is no. The USS Yorktown that participated in the battle is at the bottom of the ocean. The other question is how long were the Japanese survivors of the main action at Midway kept in isolation? Basically, they were kept in isolation until they recovered, and then they were sent back out to sea. So they were really, if you were injured in the battle, you were kept in special wards. You were really not allowed to discuss what had happened. The other question was, were there any submarines sunk? And the answer is, I don't think so. Not that I'm aware of. but I'm not 100% sure on that one. Then the other question is that Spruance decided on June 11th, 1942 to retake his 2 aircraft carriers that survived and take them back to Pearl Harbor instead of pursuing the Japanese fleet. And was that the right or wrong decision? He was really told he needed to hang on to his aircraft carriers. And in addition to that, a lot of his planes were now in the bottom of the ocean. So even if he managed to find the Japanese fleet, he really didn't have enough planes to do much to it.
And then I believe there's 4 aircraft carrier museums in the United States where you can actually go visit an aircraft carrier, and some of these have links to the World War II era. There's the USS Intrepid in New York City. There's the USS Yorktown in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, which is right outside of Charleston. We talked about that. Corpus Christi, Texas has the USS Lexington, and San Diego, California has the USS Midway. So I don't think there's any other aircraft carriers. If that's not correct, you can let us know.
So one of the other questions is how many servicemen died when the Yorktown sank? The answer is I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but it probably was a small number. They were attacked, so people were killed in the initial, and then they didn't, when it finally got hit by the 2 torpedoes, there was a skeleton crew on board. More people actually died when the USS Hammond was hit. So the USS Hammond was supplying power and was basically almost attached to the aircraft carrier. So the torpedoes came in and it hit both the USS Hammond and it hit the aircraft carrier. So almost everybody on board the USS Hammond died when they got hit, because they get hit by one torpedo, and the whole ship just went up. But most of the people who were repair people on board the USS Yorktown survived the initial hit and were taken off kind of at their leisure. Obviously, there was a rush to get off board a sinking ship, but most people who were killed on the USS Hammond. So the exact number, I want to say about 50 or 60. I apologize, I just don't know off the top of my head.
That's okay. Okay, well, why don't we call it evening? Deirdre,
it's 9 o'clock. I think it's time.
Deirdre, thank you so much for sharing all this knowledge with it. If you are still listening, I'll email out some links that has some additional information as far as other programs you have coming up, and then also the link for this program if you joined us late, or if you're like me and want to listen to it or watch it a second time. So Deirdre, thank you so much. Everyone have a great rest of your week. Happy 80th anniversary to our men in arms that fought the Battle of Midway for us. And we'll see you next time. Deirdre, anything else before we sign off?
Nope. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And I appreciate all the great questions.
Oh, good. John Barry says there's also the USS Hornet in Alameda, California, which is right outside of Oakland. Thanks, John. I appreciate that. So there's 5 aircraft carriers you can go visit on your adult field trips. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week. Stay safe. We'll see you next time.